Welcome to tonight's special interest group meeting of the Community Hospital Association. And today the talk is about fundraising and volunteering in community hospitals and research done by Steph Haydon, who has also kindly agreed to do the special interest group meeting today. So as I said, just we can use the chat function to ask any questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions after when Steph's finished. So I'll leave Helen Tucker was going to do today, but she's actually pulled out, unfortunately, for an emergency. So I'm going to hand over to Steph to introduce herself, let us know a little bit about her background, and let us know about the really interesting work that she's doing in about community hospitals.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Can I just check if you can all see that? Kirsty, your little face is on my screen, so can you just nod or give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Fantastic. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today and for having me take over your evening. As Kirsty said, my name is Steph Haydon. I am a research fellow at the University of Birmingham's Third Sector Research Centre. And over the past couple of years, I've been working on a big multi-institutional research project that is looking at charity and the NHS. Today, I'm just going to be sharing a snapshot of the findings from that project, looking at a particular group of hospitals where the communities didn't just fundraise for or volunteer at their hospital, but actually took control of their hospital over from the NHS. So I'm going to start off by taking us back to last summer. So in July 2023, we had this in the headline: St Ives residents raise £1 million to save community hospital closed by NHS. So the Edward Hain Memorial Hospital in St Ives, Cornwall, was closed in and by the NHS. Residents were furious because not only had they been as they saw it, robbed of a vital healthcare amenity, but they were also really worried that the NHS was going to sell off that hospital building to developers for it to be turned into just more tourist accommodation in the town. So instead, led by the League of Friends, they collectively raised £1 million, which came from a mix of active fundraising, specifically around that time over the period of a year or two, a quite considerable mortgage of about £400,000, and combined with funds that had previously been raised by the League of Friends over a number of years prior. That £1 million was then used to buy back the community hospital, and it's now being run as a health centre. Now, on the face of it, this seems like quite a unique, fantastical event, right? A community taking over their hospital to avoid its closure. But actually, there is quite significant past precedence of this happening. And that is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about these 10 hospitals, which did exactly what the Edward Hain Memorial Hospital did just a little bit longer ago in history. So these are the only 10 hospitals that we know of besides the St Ives Edward Hain Memorial Hospital that have done this move from NHS hospital back to community or charitable control. The first one to do this move was Tadworth Court Children's Hospital, now known as the Children's Trust, and it transferred out in 1984. You may be familiar with the Children's Trust. It was actually founded in about the 1930s as the Countryside Retreat for Great Ormond Street Hospital. The next, then kind of moving in order in terms of the year that they left the NHS for charitable control, was Hoylake Cottage Hospital, then Tarpley Cottage Hospital, Mildmay Mission Hospital. Again, some of you may be familiar. Since the 1980s, it has done quite pioneering work as a dedicated health and care centre for people with HIV/AIDS. And I believe recently it was recognised for that work as one of the London Overground lines as being renamed the Mildmay line in its honour. Then we have Holbeach, Brackley, Tetbury, Rye Memorial Hospital, Odium, and finally Wells in 2006. There was then, as far as we're aware, quite a considerable gap between 2006 and 2023 with the St Ives Hospital. What we're interested in with each of these cases is how and why they transferred from NHS to charitable control. Why did this happen? What motivated this shift? How did it take place in practice? The first step to kind of understanding that is looking at and kind of recognizing the policy context against which this took place. So the first one that we know of, the first transfer was, as I said, Tadworth Court in 1984. And from 1979 in this country, we had a series of successive Conservative governments that pursued what has kind of since been referred to as NHS rationalisation. So really pursuing efficiency in the health service, centred on the belief that the service could be run more effectively and more cost efficiently if services were condensed around a fewer number of hospitals, particularly larger general hospitals, than being dispersed across a larger number of hospitals of all shapes and sizes. The result of this was a long-term trend of hospital closures. Now, importantly, these hospital closures predate the Conservative era from the 1980s. We have seen a trend of hospital closures, particularly of small hospitals, pretty much since the NHS was founded. But the rate at which small hospitals in particular were closed very much increased under the Conservatives. We don't know exactly how many hospitals were closed during this period, but one of the health ministers of the time, Ken Clarke, who's shown here on the left, somewhat infamously once stated that during his tenure as Minister of Health, I closed more hospitals than most people had hot dinners. So we can infer it was quite a lot of hospitals that were closed. The second kind of key policy trend from this time was active and explicit support for voluntary action in the health sector. So prior to 1980, hospitals and other NHS bodies had been prohibited from actively fundraising. They could still receive voluntary contributions, they could still receive donations if people wanted to make them, and Leagues of Friends were certainly an active body for many, many hospitals up and down the country. But hospitals themselves couldn't actively go out and fundraise. That all changed in 1980 under the Conservatives. They also expressed explicit support for voluntary takeovers of hospital. So acknowledging the fact that under their reign, a lot of hospitals were being closed or were going to be closed. Another one of the Conservative health ministers during this time, Patrick Jenkins, stated in 1979, "We are prepared to discuss in some cases the question of leasing hospitals at peppercorn rents to voluntary bodies to run themselves rather than that they should be closed." So they saw voluntary action as kind of a way of keeping some hospitals open if communities really, really wanted to retain their hospital. And that's the key kind of first finding from this research, is that in every one of these 10 cases that we have looked at, the hospital transferred from NHS to charity control to avoid permanent closure. None of these transfers took place because of some kind of perceived benefits of voluntary action or perceived benefits of voluntarism as a way of running a hospital. They didn't think that, oh, if we are run by a charity instead of the NHS, we're going to do a better job for our community. It was the only course of action that these communities felt they had left to actually just avoid complete permanent closure of their hospital. These hospitals were going to be closed predominantly for kind of economic reasons. So the health authorities in each case presented various kind of economic rationale behind closing the hospitals. So in the case of Tarpley Hospital, for example, the health authority blamed, quote, insufficiency of funding for the next financial year, end quote. In the case of Mildmay, the Tower Hamlets local health authority had been tasked with saving £2 million in the course of 1 year. Closing Mildmay Hospital was projected to make 1.2 million of that necessary 2 million savings. Tadworth is quite an interesting one here. Tadworth Court, as I mentioned, was founded as the countryside retreat of Great Ormond Street. And even in the 1980s, when it was then facing closure, it was still originally a part of the Great Ormond Street group. It was still run under that umbrella. And in the early 1980s, Great Ormond Street was in financial trouble and was looking like it was going to have to close beds. It wanted to close Tadworth and sell off the site as a means of raising funds to keep Great Ormond Street, kind of the HQ of the group, open and running. Hospitals saw the closure attempts quite differently. So the health authorities presented this kind of very economic rationale, very deliberate sort of efficiency-based logic for closing the hospitals. The hospital communities instead blamed a war of attrition. They said this isn't just coming out of the blue. This has been a long-term trend where you have slowly cut and cut and cut the services and resources at this hospital. So the staff at Tadworth, for example, blamed a, quote, deliberate starving of funds, unquote, to the hospital. And at Mildmay Hospital, an ex-medical superintendent of the hospital wrote to the Minister of Health saying that since 1974, successive authorities in the NHS have been steadily reducing the services of the hospital by a policy of attrition, to such an extent that there is now a threat of closing it altogether. These closure attempts didn't necessarily surprise the communities involved. It had been a long time coming. It typically went something like the health authority deciding to move one of the services provided at that small hospital to a nearby general hospital. That then meant they needed fewer staff. It also meant that they became a less attractive prospect for staff to work at. So suddenly they had staffing issues. If you have insufficient staff, that creates safety concerns. So now more wards need to be closed, more services need to be cut, and it just creates a vicious circle where slowly and slowly it is ground down until, yes, it does make the most economic sense to just close the hospital altogether. Importantly, this wasn't the first time in these hospitals' histories that they were facing closure. Several had faced closure attempts multiple times throughout their history since joining the NHS, which meant that these communities then had experience opposing that closure. As soon as these kind of planned closures of each of these 10 hospitals were announced, there was significant community backlash, and massive campaigns were organised and led against the closure of their hospital. Now, importantly, these campaigns aimed at keeping the hospital open within the NHS. It was very much save our hospital from closure, keep it open. It wasn't originally around taking it over under a new charitable trust. These campaigns featured, for example, flyers and posters such as this for Tarpley Hospital that would be seen across the community in shop windows. People had them in their house windows for people going past, in the back of their cars. It was everywhere. In the case of Mildmay Mission Support, Mildmay Mission Hospital, as an example, 10,000 people signed a petition against the hospital's closure, and hundreds more wrote letters just like this one at the bottom in the middle to their local Member of Parliament and the Minister of Health, appealing to them to keep the hospital open. These campaigns featured rallies, which brought together patients, members of the local community, members of staff. They featured public kind of attention across local newspapers, sometimes national newspapers, and local radio stations. Rye Hospital also benefited from some celebrity support. So those of you with good vision may have spotted in the bottom right corner here a familiar face. That is Sir Paul and his wife, Linda McCartney. They were at the time local residents of Rye. And so when they heard that Rye Hospital was facing closure, they got involved in the campaign. They became the famous face of the campaign against closure, and they helped that campaign to achieve national media attention. Part of these campaigns was also a financial element. The campaigns often involved setting up what was called a fighting fund, so people could donate to and financially support the campaigns against the hospital closure. When analysing all these kind of different campaign materials, so the petitions against closure, the letters that campaigners wrote, the interviews that they conducted with a local newspaper, all of these kinds of different medias, in analysing them, and what we've seen is that these hospitals were not just seen as kind of medical facilities. They were not just seen as old clinical hospitals. They were seen, yes, as a site of healthcare, but they were also portrayed as being somehow special and being a local asset to their communities. And I want to spend a bit of time looking at each of these different kind of representations of the hospital in turn. So first of all, each of these 10 hospitals were portrayed as a site of healthcare. Now, for the vast majority of these hospitals, that site of healthcare was predominantly portrayed as being accessible. It was the local hospital. Here we have on the right a word cloud of some of the kind of key words that campaigners used to describe the hospital and to defend it. It was a local hospital. It was in the community. People could be treated by their own doctor. It saved time traveling to the hospital. It was a massive relief to patients and their families. One patient of Tarpley Hospital said it's very important the hospital stays open for the local community who could otherwise waste time traveling to Chester or Crewe just for a dressing. With traveling and waiting, it becomes almost a day event. So the fact that the hospital was located in the town in which they lived made it more accessible and made it a lot more convenient, a lot easier for them to get to and from. This access was portrayed as really, really significant. It wasn't just about saving time, it was also about saving lives. And it wasn't just portrayed by patients, but also patients' families and carers. For example, the wife of a former patient of Rye Hospital said, "My husband had a heart attack, and this was always the most convenient place to come. It's saving lives instead of having to go all that way to Hastings." Now, in the case of Rye Hospital, the campaign against Rye's closure gained particular prominent public support when actually there was a young teenager who had died of an asthma attack whilst en route to the nearby General Hospital at Hastings after the casualty department at Rye had been closed. Tadworth is a notable different kind of outlier amongst this group. So Tadworth was never really portrayed as a local hospital, unlike the others. Instead, it was defended and portrayed as a specialist hospital. So as I've mentioned, Tadworth was founded as a children's hospital. It remains a children's hospital today. And so the campaign to save Tadworth from closure in the 1980s really focused on that specialist care that it provided, particularly end-of-life care for terminally ill children. This was really defended and upheld by members of staff at Tadworth and by patients' parents. The Minister of Health at the time, Ken Clarke, agreed that this specialist service was important. And he said it wasn't so much a question of whether or not these services should be provided, just of where they should be made available. The second kind of key representation of the hospital that I identified is that these hospitals were somehow special. So they were portrayed as having this unique, homely atmosphere. Campaigners emphasized that these hospitals were like a second home to them. They described the spirit, the heart, the soul of the hospital, and this atmosphere that was special and meaningful to them. A Tarpley patient, for example, said the hospital provides a high degree of community care where patients are looked after by their own doctors and nurses who come from the local community. The fact, again, that these hospitals are based in the community means that not only do patients come from that community, but also most of the members of staff do as well. So there's a sense of neighbourly kinship between them. The patient in the bed next to you, the member of staff treating you, are familiar to you. They are known people. They're not strangers. This kind of homely atmosphere, this idea of a hospital being a home from home, was contrasted against far larger general hospitals, which were viewed as more impersonal. The homely, unique, special atmosphere and spirit of hospitals was viewed as only achievable in small hospitals. And importantly, all 10 of these hospitals were small hospitals. At the time at which they faced closure and the time at which they transferred out to charity control, I think that the largest number of beds that any of them had was about 60. So all of them had fewer than 100 beds. They are small organizations. And that meant for these campaigners that you could have that more personal and personable atmosphere. In the case of Mildmay Hospital, this unique special atmosphere was portrayed as very much stemming from the religious spirit of the hospital. So Mildmay was founded in the 1800s as an evangelical Christian hospital, and it was still run as an evangelical Christian hospital when it faced closure in the 1980s. Defending the hospital was therefore driven in part by religious morals and a defense of religious freedoms. So closing the hospital was described as being a great loss to the Christian witness. It was a great loss to the missionary societies who made use of this hospital. People who wrote letters against the closure to members of Parliament, to the Minister of Health, really pointed to the religious foundation and role that this hospital had in the communities. It wasn't just healing the body, but also the mind and the spirit too. These campaigners also pointed to various protections that had been put in place in the NHS Act of 1946. Clause 61 of that Act very specifically stated that any denominational hospital like Mildmay was permitted to continue running as such thereafter. Well, come 1984, when Mildmay was then facing closure, it was the only evangelical Christian hospital left in the NHS. And so it was upheld as symbolic of their religious values and of all other Christian hospitals that had come before it. And this was really espoused not just by staff and patients of the hospitals, but also volunteers that had been there, Christians and church leaders across the nation. The final key characteristic of these hospitals was that they were a local asset. They were owned by and for the local community. Campaigners used language of our hospital, our building. It's not theirs, it's ours. One campaigner at Rye, for example, said, in referring to the health authority that was trying to close their hospital, they have no right, it isn't their building, it's our building. A lot of posters throughout these campaigns use language like save our hospital, keep your hospital open, your hospital needs you. It was very much centered around this idea of the local community owned and had rights to keep their local hospital. Part of this stemmed very much from the kind of historical legacy of these hospitals. Again, this was very much portrayed mostly by local residents, whether or not they had been staff or patients at the hospitals. Letters written against the closure pointed to the historical origins of the hospital, the fact that it predated the NHS, it had been founded by and for the local community. It pointed to the legacy of the people who had originally founded and funded it before the NHS, and saying closing it is against their wishes, it is against their memory, against their legacy. Again, in the case of Rye, campaigners highlighted that Rye Hospital in particular, same actually as Tarpley, was founded as a war memorial hospital. So, quote, it was given by people many, many years ago as a memorial to the people who died in the First World War. It is disgusting what they're doing, trying to close the hospital. At Rye, the names of the local people who had died during the First World War were still written on the wall of the hospital. It's really important at this point to note that this idea of multiple roles and multiple meanings of hospitals in and for their communities is not unique to these 10 hospitals that I've looked at. Prior research looking at hospitals, including community hospitals, but also larger hospitals, whether they're facing closure or not, has shown that hospitals have multiple meanings for their communities, including this idea of being a local asset, part of historical legacy, and of having this kind of special, unique, homely atmosphere. What is different in these hospitals, what distinguishes these from others, is the combination of the following characteristics. So when we start asking, well, why did these hospitals move out to charitable support when plenty others didn't? We know that hundreds upon hundreds more faced closure in the NHS. Why did only these 10 move out? Well, we believe it may have been a combination of these features. So firstly, they had a very strong history of voluntary support, predating their potential closure. So they had, for example, leagues of friends who had been supportive of the hospital for decades. They had legions of fundraisers of people who would donate to the hospital, who would volunteer their time there, which meant that these could kind of more easily be mobilized into campaigns to support the hospital against closure. They didn't have to build up that support from scratch. Instead, it was redirecting the support that they already had. Leagues of friends were particularly important in this instance. So, for example, in some of the cases, I'll note this is before the days of GDPR, leagues of friends basically kind of volunteered up their mailing lists and address books of people who had previously supported the hospital, which meant that the campaign groups could then immediately start with a list of people that they knew were more amenable to their appeals. Secondly, each of these hospitals had a recognized campaign leader, an individual who already typically was in some way known as working at being supportive of the hospital, offering, for example, a former trustee of the hospital, a chair of the League of Friends. And these individuals formed campaign committees that were known as action or battle committees to kind of lead the defence against the closure of the hospital, and later to negotiate with health authorities around alternatives to closure as well. Third, and this is really key, in each of these cases, all the different communities involved were united behind a single campaign. So we've seen in other cases, for example, Booth Hall Children's Hospital in Manchester was closed in 2009. There was a massive campaign against it, but there were multiple campaign groups. So there were multiple campaigns which had kind of competing frames, competing end objectives. They didn't coordinate with each other, which really fractured the kind of response and results. The hospital ended up being closed. In each of these 10 cases that we've looked at and that I'm talking about today, it was only a single campaign, which managed to kind of unite all the different communities, regardless of what particular meaning the hospital held for them, behind a single shared objective of keeping the hospital open. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, nothing to do with the community side of the hospital, but actually to do with the health authorities. In each of these cases, the hospital was located in an area where the health authority was amenable to alternatives. They weren't just going all gung-ho, we're just going to close the hospital. That's what we said we're going to do, and so we're going to do it. They actually engaged in dialogue with campaigners. They listened to, debated different possible alternatives, and at the end of the day, they agreed to supporting it as a voluntary effort to passing over control. And it's at that point of kind of transfer of the hospitals that these cases significantly differ from each other. So in some of the cases, only control of the hospital was transferred. So the hospital site, hospital building itself remained an NHS asset, but now it was going to be run under a new purposefully established charitable trust that leased the site from the NHS at a payable rent. In other cases, not only did control shift over, but ownership of the building the site did as well. It was bought back by the community. So a huge round of fundraising had to take place. In Rye, for example, £5 million was raised, £1 million of which came from Paul and Partney, for the site and the building to be purchased from the NHS, which is what we did, what happened in the case of St Ives Edward Hain Hospital that we introduced to this talk. I thought it would be good to briefly speak about kind of what happened to these hospitals since they left the NHS. So in the early years of their transfer, some of them received kind of immediate government assistance. Tadworth Court received the most significant support. They received a grant every year for the first 3 years of £750,000. That's equivalent to more than £2 million each year in today's money. That is quite a considerable sum compared to most of the other cases. Tarpley, for instance, which is far more exemplary of the other cases that I've looked at, received a one-off grant of £55,000. That's more reflective of the rest of this cohort. The purpose of this grant was to very much ease the transition from NHS hospital to charity hospital. It was to give them a little bit of money just while they kind of found their feet and worked out alternative sources of income. But that idea of finding alternative sources of income didn't really come to fruition. So I examined the annual records for most of these hospitals, not all of them because the annual records aren't available for all of them, but for about 7 of them, I have looked through the annual records over the past 30 to 40 years, aka since they transferred out up to today. For most of these hospitals, the majority of their funding still comes from the NHS. It's typically in the region of 80 to 99%. So they still are funded much in the same as they used to be before. Now that they are owned or simply controlled by charitable bodies, yes, charity is still a significant resource for them, but just like when they were in the NHS and just like other NHS hospitals today, charity is only used for the extras. it's not used to provide core services. Instead, it's about staff and patient amenities, it's about equipment, and funding building extensions and redevelopment. So I want to just kind of wrap up with looking at what do these cases tell us? Why are they important? Why should we care? Well, first of all, they're examples not just of kind of voluntary action filling state gaps where, okay, we saw that the NHS wanted to cut certain services from the community and the community stepped in to fill that hole. They can also be seen as resistance to state control. The state was to made a decision around closing the hospital, and because of community resistance to that, those hospitals are still there today. This research also highlights the diversity of communities behind community hospitals. In looking through the kind of different meanings and representations of the hospitals, we also looked at how those meanings were kind of split across different stakeholder groups: patients, staff, former patients and former staff, patients, friends, family and carers, different religious groups, hospital volunteers, and so on. Local residents, people that didn't necessarily even have any connection to the hospital beyond living in the same town in which it was based. These different communities each have different ways of seeing and of valuing the hospital, which can give us important lessons when we're then trying to seek funds or support from those different community groups of how we might best appeal to their values and concerns. These also highlight the influence of charity on NHS policy. It's worth emphasising again, every single one of these hospitals was set to be closed in the NHS before the communities took it on. Those hospitals are still open, and most of them are still significantly funded by the NHS as a result of that charitable action. As a result of that, they raise kind of this final question, perhaps a concern, about the connections between charity and health inequities. It's wonderful that in each of these cases, the communities were able to step in and to take over their hospital. But what about the communities that don't have the resources to do that, that don't have a leader, that don't have strong histories of voluntary action and of voluntary support for the hospitals, because they don't have people with significant financial resources in the community. They don't have Paul McCartney living down the road who can become the figurehead of the campaign, who can donate £1 million to saving the hospital. What does this mean for those hospitals and their ability to access and maintain their local healthcare? That's everything that I wanted to say about those 10 hospital cases, but I wanted to just kind of finish up by pointing towards the wider research project that this has been a part of. So I'm just sharing one small part of the research that has been going on under what's called the Border Crossings Research Project. This is a multi-institutional project covering the University of Birmingham, where I'm based, but also the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the University of Strathclyde, and the University of Glasgow. We look, as I've said, at charity in the NHS broadly, both past and present. And I would encourage you, if you'd like to know more about the project, to take a look at our website, the link for which is on the slide here. Here you can find out about the people that are in the team, the kind of research that we've been doing, as well as some outputs and resources that we've put together, including this timeline of fundraising and the NHS. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention. I look forward to hearing any of your comments and questions and to having a great discussion.